Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Maris Kreisman, and I run events and marketing at McNally Jackson. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event for the store. If you go to McNallyJackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. Please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversations for your questions, so start thinking about them now. You can use the Zoom chat function to submit any question you have, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're glad that even though we can't all be in the same room together at the moment, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we've changed phases from staying at home to opening for curbside pickup to again admitting customers into our 4 locations, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this one and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. Throughout the evening, I'll post links in the chat to buy the newly published paperback edition of the Cactus League from McNally Jackson, which Charles McGrath described, well, the hardcover edition, as funny and poignant and lovingly observed in the New York Times Book Review. We're so delighted to celebrate tonight with Emily Nemens. She's the editor of the Paris Review, and she was previously the co-editor of the Southern Review, and her debut novel, which we're celebrating tonight, was an NPR Best Book of 2020 and is a finalist for the Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of the Year. And joining her tonight is Gish, who is the author of The Resistors, as well as 4 previous novels, a story collection, and 2 works of fiction. Her honors include the Lannan Literary Award for Fiction and the Mildred and Harold Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She teaches from time to time in China and otherwise lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're so happy to have you here tonight. And Emily, would you like to start off with a little reading?
Absolutely. Thank you, Maris, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Gish, for chatting with me tonight. And thank you to all of you for joining, Maddie for putting this together, and McNally for hosting. You know, I had my first book event last January with Gish at Key West Literary Seminar. So it feels like a nice homecoming that way. And of course, I launched the book last February with McNally at the new store in South Street Seaport, and that was such a wonderful in-person event. So it feels really special to be rounding the bags, as it were, with you all tonight. I wanted to read just a little bit, a few pages from the first chapter of the Cactus League. What you need to know, this is a little bit farther into the book. It's a nice moment. We're meeting the protagonist of the book, Jason Goodyear. What you need to know, the Joe that is being referenced is Joe DiMaggio. The team that's being referenced is the Los Angeles Lions, which is a fictional baseball team that plays out in Arizona every spring. The hero of this chapter, the protagonist of chapter 1 at least, is Michael. He is a former left fielder and current minor league batting coach for the Lions organization. And he gets to Arizona early every year. Pitchers and catchers usually show up around Valentine's Day. And I like this moment in the book because it's happening right about now, February 4th, 2 weeks before the teams arrive. Michael shows up, tries to get settled. And unfortunately for him, he shows up and someone's trashed his house entirely and completely. And he has spent all day throwing away takeout containers and pulling up carpet. The visitors left Michael's bats where they were, in a worn-looking canvas bag in the far corner of the garage. And at the end of that first long day, Michael begs off dinner plans with Audrey and the Walshes, grabs the bag, and heads to the stadium. He's driven halfway to the old complex when he remembers that it will be empty or gone. It is getting turned into a new parking garage for the adjacent mall. This spring, the Lions are playing at some brand new complex, Salt Lick or Salt Stick or something. Michael can't quite remember its name. He doesn't have the keys yet. Last week, Woody Botter, the GM, sent out a long-winded email about the procedure for getting a new set. So he'll have to track down a maintenance guy or security to open up the cage. He's got his credentials on him, always does. Hopefully somebody will be around, but not too many somebodies. He doesn't want to pretend everything is la-di-da tonight. Michael isn't quite sure where he's going, but knows the complex is next to the casino on the east side, all of it built on Indian land. Talking Stick Casino is not a place he's been, but it's tall and gaudy and flashing spotlights into the night sky, so he points the cart towards its beacon. He has to loop around the sports complex twice to find a way in, an unlit boulevard that splits the parking lot in two, one of the lots still waiting for its stripes. The landscapers have dropped off the plants for the median, but transplanted only a few. The rest loiter in black plastic tubs. For a flash, he thinks about taking a couple of smaller cacti to restart his own battered collection. Audrey loves her succulents, but he shakes the idea from his mind. He is not a thief. The new stadium is a hulking shadow lit by the occasional exit sign. Through the gates, he can see a broad concourse, the spotless counters of vendors who have yet to move in. There's no good view of left field, but he tries to imagine it as he circles the stadium. Big, small. Of all the corners of the field, left is the most malleable, the easiest to shorten or stretch per the site plan. It annoys Michael that while the infield and its dimensions are sacred, the 90-foot base path, the 60 feet 6 inches from rubber to home, the 95 feet between the mound and the grass line, his domain can be doubled or halved, depending on the street grid and how many seats some owner is trying to fit. Look at the green monster, only 310 to the wall, while the deep part of old Yankee Stadium was 457. Another reason Michael admired Joe. In 1937, he's hit 46 home runs in that stadium, even with its farther than far left center wall. The Lions' Culver City home, a nondescript, moderately nostalgic stadium built in the 90s, has a gigantic left, which is part of why they invested in Goodyear. That man has strong legs and an arm like a rocket launcher. The first ring of practice fields is dark, but there is a glow beyond them, and he hears something that sounds like a bat making contact. He walks towards the noise. The lights hanging just inside the upper net cast webbed shadows onto the paved approach, with a bigger, batter-shaped shadow spilling into the walkway. Thwunk. The next ball is spit out of the machine. The shadow batter swings, and a swing that Michael recognizes instantly as Jason Goodyear's. Decisive, graceful, certain. The left fielder makes solid contact and sends a line drive into the dark of the cage's far net. The hit would have been a stand-up double, maybe a triple with Jason's speed. He's fast and not afraid to use it. Another pitch, another line drive, this one angling slightly more to the right. He makes it look so easy, Michael thinks. The machine isn't flaming at 95, but these balls aren't under 80 either. A third, another notch over. He is doing it on purpose, Michael realizes, hitting clockwise across the cage like a minute hand ticking around the hour. He knows Jason is obsessive about his swing, poring over tapes of opposing pitchers and his own performance, asking for advice from everyone, Michael included. But this is something else. When the bucket is done, Jason sets his bat against the net. It is then that he sees Michael's shadow in the darkness. Who's there? The player tenses. It isn't a genius move to leave yourself so exposed, no one for a half mile in any direction. What would happen if trouble came around? Run for the casino? But men don't think that way of their vulnerabilities. Michael knows he never did. It's Coach Taylor. He steps out of the shadows, shows his palms. The player's posture relaxes and his mouth splits into a crooked smile. He's good looking, a Tom Cruise smile and Paul Newman eyes. Heartthrob, that's what Michael's daughters called him, and he remembers the collective sob that happened around the country when Jason's secret wedding to that kindergarten teacher was revealed. Clean cut too, no visible tattoos, no billboards in his skivvies, no cursing when he strikes out, just a tight-lipped huff, and he's right back to the dugout. Even if the holier-than-thou bit gets a bit old, his teammates call him Goody Two-Shoes behind his back. This is a solid man. Hey coach, thought I had the place to myself tonight. Me too, Michael says.
That was wonderful, Emily. And
Okay.
and it really is such a pleasure, well, to hear you read and also to see you again.
Yeah.
So as you mentioned, we, we had the great good fortune to debut our two books at last year this time at the Key West literary seminar. It was very unusually a seminar with a sports theme. I think it's the only time they've ever done such a thing.
Yeah.
And there you and I were at it. I have to say before I came, I just thought, who am I going to talk to? You know, I mean, everybody there's going to be like a sports writer,
Right.
but there you were, and so it was a great pleasure, and it was wonderful to be there. You know, at the debut of your wonderful book. I mean, of course, I read it. In preparation for the trip, and I thought, oh my God, this is so wonderful. But one of the things and it's wonderful to be here now for the paperback. And let me just if I can just pause for a moment to think about this moment, the paperback moment. One of the things that's happened, of course, is that they changed the cover quite a bit.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know if you want to hold up the old cover.
This was the old one, and this is the paperback. I
Yeah.
would remark just that the uncanny coincidence of writing literary fiction about baseball is a strange and small category, I think, in the big scheme of things, and that you and I both had books, literary fiction about baseball coming out on the first week of February with these beautifully blue covers. It just felt like kismet or coincidence or something. There were magnets somewhere, Gish, pulling us together. But yes, we do have, it is quite a new cover, which I love. I think, spoke at length with our designer, Alex Murto, and talking about, and the Picador team really wanted to build in a bit more narrative to the cover. This is gorgeous and I love it, but and certainly is evocative of the place and the time, which is to say, a little bit before a quiet moment, before all of the action of the season. But a lot happens in the Cactus League, and there, unfortunately, there is some violence, and there is, some shattering of people's lives and concentric circles of how that impacts other people. And I just can't believe they found such a striking image that embodies all of that.
Yeah, and it's just, of course, one of the things that's happened is, the first cover is beautiful, but it does, and especially with the title, The Cactus League, it almost suggests kind of a whimsical book. And I remember when I read your book, I thought, oh, wait, this is a lot more than a whimsical book. I mean, there are funny moments, and I love the lingerie parties, and it's not like it's all doom and gloom. But it's actually quite a serious book. And it's funny because I wrote a dystopia, but reading your book, I thought, well, this is actually kind of also a dystopia. It's the underbelly of America that you're really writing about. And so I'm really glad they changed the cover. And I will say also, it seems so much more fitting for our present moment. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I think that nobody would have picked the first book up and sort of said, well, this book is going to be about America now. And I think the new cover, it's much clearer that, yes, this is about our America. There's a lot of desperation here. And a lot of the things that are, that we're talking about in the news and so on is, it's reflected in your book. So I thought it was a wonderful, wonderful choice. I do think in a general kind of way, you've written a book about somebody named Jason Goodyear, in a very, very, very bad year.
Well, I mean, I think this is a question for both of us, right? To think about dystopia, and yours is very much more overtly dystopian in the mold of Margaret Atwood, and thinking about a future America. I'm writing about 2011, and and part of that was just because it took me 9 years to write, and part of that was because I was really interested, even as we move farther away from the last recession, in looking at that near historical moment of what does the way a community responds to a really bleak set of circumstances say about that community. And I just remember that moment a few weeks after we were all together, like realizing that writing about a recession was really pertinent to 2020 in a way, of course, I wish it wasn't, but how the themes of the book in terms of, housing insecurity, vulnerability, how we treat our people who are, the aged and the aging, just felt a lot more resonant. But, I didn't have a crystal ball. Did you?
No, no, no. But of course, it's people have said the same thing to me. It's like, oh my God, it's so prescient. And the same things you're talking about. How the surplus are treated. How the elderly are treated. How, yeah, all the structural problems. And it is interesting that both of us were writing about baseball, and at the same time as we were writing baseball, it is the belly button of America, and and it's all there. All the desperation, all the and both the glory of it, and kind of the glory and the dream of it, and the very disturbing reality of it are there simultaneously.
Right.
And so it was really wonderful, to meet you, of course, because there you are also using the baseball lens to look at many things that have nothing to do with baseball. So I think both of us, we both hit the baseball fans. They're all very excited. But people who are not at all interested in baseball are also finding a lot. Certainly there's a lot in your book that, you don't have to be a baseball fan to recognize the dynamics, the women, the drugs, the desperation,
Right. Yeah, I was really
so it's
interested in
really, it's very resonant. And like I say, in a way that maybe people who think it's a baseball book may not realize.
Oh, well, thank you. I was really interested in, community dynamics and thinking about, um, it's as much about upstairs, downstairs, right? And the class structures of a service economy, and you know, the sort of the hierarchy that's built into major and minor leagues. And of course, I was thinking a whole lot about that this year. Sort of the fallback plan for so many of these players as they go into the minors. And I don't know that you would have followed it, or many people on this call would have, but this like huge contraction of the minor league system this year um, just closed a lot of doors for a lot of aspiring athletes. And so thinking about those structures of power and opportunity, um, you know, as framed into a baseball stadium, but I think they could apply to all sorts of systems of power in America.
Yeah, it's an incredible microcosm. So, I want to talk about a little bit about the structure of the book, because of course, so you set out to tell, a lot of the stories behind the story. So, it's a way in which we think about narrative. We think, oh, well, this is the story, of course, 3 hours, whatever happened. We think, oh, story, but you were great pains to sort of say, actually, this book is not about that story. It's about that story, but it's about all the other stories that are around that story. And when you do a beautiful job of both sort of like, maintaining an arc, but also telling all these other stories. And I wonder if we want to talk about a little bit about how you got to that structure and how you made that work, because I think at one point in the beginning, a parabola. It's funny. I think when I wrote your book, I thought of it more as like a spiral. You know what I mean? So it's spiraling around to all, like the Guggenheim.
Right.
It's spiraling around to all the to all these stories, but it's still traveling.
Right. Well, thank
And
you for making that. Yeah.
But I wonder if you want to talk. And I will say that for a first novel, that's a very daring to have done. And I want to talk a little bit about the process of how you got there.
Yeah, certainly. Well, thank you for comparing it to a Frank Lloyd Wright building. That is important.
Especially since Taliesin is actually in your book.
Yeah, I think it started for me. I wanted to write against sort of the conceit and the constraint of most sports narratives, which are filtering and funneling and tightening towards the end of the season, right? And the big game, I think in particular, I really, Don DeLillo and the opening of Underworld has, this, World Series game, or if it's about the last at bat of the the bottom of the ninth, whatever it is, there's this sort of it felt almost inevitable vanishing point that everyone relies on so much. And I think particularly after this year where there was 2 months of regular baseball and 1 month of postseason baseball, like that just that equation is sort of a given, but I wanted to upset it and if anything invert it. So writing about the beginning of the season rather than the end, I didn't feel like I had that necessary funnel or that requirement to build up until a final moment. Of course, there is a final moment in my book, and things do come together. Sort of, it's not quite bottom of the night stakes, but I wanted to point to something that felt just as important if it is entirely pedestrian and outside of the stadium. So that was this really freeing moment when I realized, I'm gonna invert the triangle essentially. And then without like being too much of a sports nerd, there's so much numerology in baseball in terms of thinking about the measurements of the field, the cycles, of 3 and of 6 and of 9, and all of the ways you can do math of a game and the different units, right, of the at bat, of the half inning, of the inning, of the game, of the series. I wanted to play with that and exploit it, and it was a really helpful framing device for me to sort of impose that structure. I mean, there were certainly weeks and months where that structure I hated more than anything, and I couldn't figure out how to make it fit. But when I recognized that, I wanted each chapter to feel like an inning where there was its own protagonist. Even in that reading, I referenced 2 different protagonists. Jason's sort of the prevailing force, but in the first chapter, it's Michael's story. And much like if you're watching a game, the person who, has the biggest hit or, the most disappointing strikeout is going to be the focal point of that moment in the game. So understanding that, the camera or otherwise the focus would shift as we move through 9 innings, of course, 9 chapters, felt like a really helpful maybe safety break, because I had so many players, girlfriends, I had so many bartenders and dancers and waitresses, identifying that I wanted to build it into a universe of 9 helped keeping this from being an 800-page fairly tedious exploration.
Well, it was not going to be tedious no matter what you did. But one of the things, of course, is if I recall correctly, you had actually started, this had actually started as stories. Do I remember that right?
Yeah, exactly. And I've always loved a really long, meaty story, an Alice Munro or Deborah Eisenberg, thinking about, the world that might exist in a novel, but somehow compressing that into 10,000, 12,000 words. So I had all of these stories. They were all taking place in the same spring. They were all taking place at the same stadium, but they were really just, almost, if you can imagine, characters walking past one another in the concourse of the stadium. Somebody's looking for popcorn, someone else is trying to get a hot dog. And they weren't talking to each other. They weren't, there were some players that would come in and out, but they cared about each. I think pretty early on, I understood the conceit and the motivations of so many of these individuals that spring. But it was quite the nut to crack to understand how they could really be assembled into a set of dominoes. And, Jason was that instigating force. And he was always the best player on the team, but when I realized that if he had a crisis, it would impact all these different people in different ways, that was my linchpin, and it sort of it suddenly felt easy to figure out who needs to come first and what needs to happen to set the next story on its path. So I was, and I'm trying to think, I read so many linked story collections and community novels while I was thinking about this, but, Yeah, I think, just sort of the economics and the situation of a major league team when they make, a Mookie Betts sort of trade, right? And there's suddenly this, what, 9-figure investment. Um, it's not just the owner's box that cares about that, the whole team. I mean, or pertinent to this week, right? That Tom Brady managed to, save this team and turn around a franchise. What happens to Tom suddenly matters to everyone, right? And so realizing that Jason could do that for this whole community was a really exciting moment.
So, it's a moment too, I'm just thinking about your whole, since I saw you last year,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about kind of like the whole journey that you've been on. So first you have these stories, then you realize you have this structure, you realize that you can actually make a novel out of this. It really is a novel. Then there's the moment you must have had a moment where you think, oh my God, I've actually done it. I know it's always got this kind of a surprising moment. I mean, I've had that experience also. It's just like, oh my God, I thought I did something off. I didn't think I could actually, pull this off, but I did. And so, but now, and now you have the paperback. And this is the moment where, a guy could sort of say, one door closes and another door opens. Would you write a book the same way again? Did you learn something? Is there something that you definitely would not do again? Do you feel like you're done with this? You're ready to go on to a completely different thing? Or do you feel like actually, you found your subject and, this is not your last baseball novel, you're going to write many more. I don't know, how does it feel right now? And a year ago, it's just like, oh my God, I wrote my book. It's really been published, and all these things are going to happen. Of course, things, as you know, happened this year that none of us could have anticipated. But now this is the moment where, of course, you're in the middle of a paperback book, but really it's done. And what does that mean? You're mute.
There we go. Yeah. I muted myself because the siren was going by, and turns out I can't unmute myself, but we're there. We're back. So you were wondering, sort of how it feels at this point, and what comes next. I was so delighted to find the structure. I think about structure all day long when I'm editing other people's work, assembling the book was so satisfying. Writing a whole community was so exciting. I don't feel like I want to write every novel with a whole team, but I've started on some new writing projects that are much smaller and more intimate in scope in terms of thinking about family relationships and interpersonal dynamics, and it feels so small. It feels I miss that energy of the whole community coming together. I don't necessarily building such a complicated hierarchy and structure into the Cactus League was something I loved. I don't know that every story needs that kind of elaborate structure, but I feel like every time I write and, I'm starting into a new chapter, I sort of look around the corner and I'm, is there an elaborate sort of crystalline structure that will solve my book around this corner, or is it around that corner? And I think that has something to do with, being interested in design and in architecture and finding systems in language, which is, of course, not a prerequisite to a compelling narrative, but that system of ordering complicated narratives into a discernible structure can help a lot of narratives, right? So I'm really glad to have found it, and I hope to find it again. But I'm also trying to give myself the space to be a little bit more messy, right? To draft it out, or even, moving past first drafts and into second and thirds, understanding that not all narratives have that same infrastructure.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read by any chance my book, tiger riding art, culture, and the independent self. But, it is very much about narrative structure, and the way that the kind of our, what we think of as a traditional Western narrative is very individualistic. And a lot of the things you said about wanting to capture a community, a whole community, not wanting to leave things out, but also struggling to find, a structure to accommodate that. It's just exactly the sort of things that I've been concerned about, kind of formally, kind of my whole career. And it's kind of, I would just,
So what do I do?
I will just plug that too, and plug my book. It's called Tiger Writing. So this were the Massey lectures that I gave at Harvard in 2012, which were
great.
published by Harvard University Press the next year.
Awesome.
So anyway, but those kind of concerns. I mean, interestingly for me, it's like, in this book, for the first time, I actually went ahead and crossed, did a little borrowing from the baseball book, from a genre book. And it was actually very interesting to me. It was the first time that that I had ever done such a thing. And it was actually interesting because, of course, as a literary writer, we're anti-genre. In a general kind of way, but it gave me new respect for genre writers, because I could sort of say I did have the big game at the end, which to me was an enormous challenge.
Right.
And I suddenly realized, like, oh, I see. With the genre writers, the good news is that they have kind of some built-in structure. Now, of course, I wrote against that structure everywhere. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's there, but there's a lot of other stuff that you would never find in a traditional baseball novel. At the same time, when I actually went to go write my big game, I understood that, oh my God, these guys, when they do this, they've got to write a big game that at once is like, like what everybody has read a million times, but has got to be different than any other game that they have ever read. And you do have thousands of games that were written before you. Yeah. And you are going to have to write a game that will surprise everybody, that will completely grow naturally, organically out of your book, that will reveal something that nobody could have really have seen. And that, like I say, I mean, so I guess, my take home was, in the end, I did do it. Thank God. I was so relieved. Oh my God. But it was interesting. Like I say, it gave me new respect for genre writers. I thought, oh my God, I see what they do. In one way it's easier, and one way it's harder. And I will say that if I had to take home, it's that I will never do it again.
Oh, really?
It's so nerve-wracking. Oh my God, because you have everything riding on that big game. And like I said, well, especially with me, I'd never written a baseball book before. Are you kidding? Yeah. I mean, it's not like I had written any games before, much less the big game. So it was an interesting, and of course, in our world, it's all about character. I mean, it's not, do you know what I mean? It's not really the game. I mean, in every game is about character, and every game is about some other conflict. We're both interested in America. In my case, the soul of America is on the line the whole way. Mm-hmm. And it's not about the game at all. Although, of course, as you also know, there are a lot of pitches and so on. Right. So I see that it's already 7:37. So it's 7:40. We're supposed to open it up to questions. Mm-hmm. And so I just if you want to talk about a little bit about what you are doing now. You have hinted that you're working on stories, something a little more intimate. Mm-hmm. Is it a story collection, or is it too early to say?
Oh, I think it's a novel. In terms of writing about baseball and continuing, you were writing speculative genre and sports genre, right? Sports writing. I have to say, I certainly don't want to pigeonhole myself into being a baseball writer, but it sure comes easy, not easy, but once you have that specialized vocabulary, once you understand, I think I landed on the intersection of, a literary sensibility, but the vocabulary and the eye to detail about sports writing, it really, feels natural. The Chronicles of Now, which is a news site that writes fiction about the news. It launched, I guess, before the news got so sideways. It launched about a year and change ago. Asked me to write about baseball, when it was suspended and they didn't know what might happen next. And I imagined the same team, 10 years now, essentially in 2020. And, most of the players would have retired, but who was hanging on, and they would have, continued to be, the grizzled old veterans at that point, and that story just poured out. And I think trying to continue to use that muscle. I wrote for the baseball prospectus this year, which is coming out in a few weeks, but recognizing, venturing more into sports writing, like really getting into the numbers and the statistics, and, not relying on sort of my emotional feelings about the Mariners circa 1996, but really leaning into, what's happening now and what might happen in the future, and drilling down into that has been, a real stretch for my writing. But then also trying to uncouple and think about, what is it about writing about sports that felt so good? And I think, it is a visceral, physical and team activity. It's an interaction with space and narrative, where and how can I use that? How can I use those activities and that action in other kinds of storytelling, in other situations and characters that are working in other spaces? Sort of the story of a place, that it was centered on a stadium feels really important. And I think I'm continuing to write about place, thinking about, iconic and kind of unique monumental structures. I don't know that I'll ever get away from that. And how people come together around those iconic structures, whether they're man-made or physical, natural, cliffs and mountains and things like that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, it's just like the little world that Jane Austen, wrote about. And the answer is it was very confined, and the fact that it was confined was part of its magic.
Right.
And and just like you, I have gone on, actually. I mean, I didn't do this on purpose. I thought I was done with baseball. Really. I think I told you, after I get to the end of my book, I just like, oh my God, never again, Plus I immediately forgot, I thought, everything I knew about baseball. But Audible Originals came to me and they wanted me to write something. Actually, I had something, and it was, anyway, it's a long story, but there was a big fight between them and Knopf would not let it go. So I had to write something else for Audible Originals because I couldn't get Knopf to move on this. And so I just thought, well, what could I possibly write? I have no ideas. I'm really tired. And I just kind of went back to baseball, and just like you, bang, on this novella, it's a novella sequel to the Sister, just popped out. It was the easiest thing I've ever written. So it's kind of, it's sort of interesting, it's sort of interesting.
And I wonder if it's, the built-in narrative of baseball, that there's always another season, that these characters, these players, have their swan songs, they have their moments, but then they have to get up and do it 161 more times, right? I think that might lend itself to sequels and to, extensions of narrative in a way that,
and prequels, don't forget.
Right. We do have the College World Series to think about.
Somebody were saying, so here are some questions. I told Maris that she could not field these, but since we're almost done anyway, I'll go ahead and field them. One of them said, would you say something about, you both say something about any other works of baseball literature that have been meaning for you, and or the stories you've told in your books? So this is baseball things. And also, Emily, I'm curious if baseball-themed submissions to the Paris Review have increased exponentially since the publication of the Cactus League. So first, let's take any other works of baseball literature that have been especially meaningful. Of course, we were, as we've mentioned before, you and I have said before, one of the things that's salient to this conversation is the fact that there is a very large body of baseball writing, almost all of it written by men.
Right.
So when we ventured into this territory, that we were kind of claiming it. Claiming its possibilities, and it's also claiming, the possibility of women. being authors of, in a tradition that is so quintessentially American. So for me, I know that claiming America was very much part of what I was doing. I've done that in other spheres too, but it's absolutely what I was doing. And so I would say that if there was any, I mean, there's so many books that are so meaningful, but if there was a single book that probably meant the most to me, it was probably Satchel Paige's autobiography. His memoir. And I think the whole subject of Satchel Paige, who many of you know was one of the greatest pitchers we've ever had, who played in the Negro Leagues, was only named, admitted to Major League Baseball this year. And the whole story of baseball, which is at once, like I say, our great dream sport, but is also very much about exclusion, was very, very important to me. And Emily, I'm sure that you likewise have books that were very important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was writing sort of in the shadow or the recent history of the art of fielding, and thinking about, there are so many baseball books. I guess we could discuss the size of the genre. I think there are more books of baseball fiction than other sports, but there's still, the amount of baseball fiction versus baseball nonfiction and baseball literature, which is, biography, history, cultural studies. I'm in a little group called the Pandemic Baseball Book Club of all these authors whose books came out about baseball last year, and I'm the only fiction writer in that. So I feel like at one time, yes, we're entering this genre, but the intersection of baseball literature and fiction is a bit narrow. And then the intersection, to your point, of women writing baseball fiction is, the tiniest sliver of the pie, right? And I recognized that when I set out on this, and certainly wanted to write against those expectations of of the genre and of the conversation, in that same really generous review that Maris quoted at the beginning, Charles McGrath also was like, how does she know these things? She never worked in baseball, and it felt a little bit, the expectations of a woman knowing about sports and being able to write convincingly about this world came as a surprise to at least that reviewer. So I was aware of all of that. I think, Chad's book, I already mentioned DeLillo. I was reading a lot more nonfiction and narrative long form, thinking about Charles McPhee and John McPhee and Roger Angell and other writers I really admired who. And then thinking about taking, character and things I've learned about character from studying novelists in general and grafting that onto long form sports narrative.
It's interesting that you should say this about character, because one of the questions here is, one of the frequent knocks of contemporary baseball, it must be narratives, is that it lacks unique or memorable characters. But all of your characters are wonderfully drawn, especially the players and coaches, although I would say the wives are actually very well drawn as well. Was it difficult to create those characters? And did you base some or any of them on real ball players?
I certainly used details of baseball players that I liked as, inspiration or added elements of real people, in terms of the inspiration for sort of building out these characters. I think more sort of an inspiration was to take some of the two-dimensional, to his point, characters, the archetypes that feel a little bit familiar and a little bit exploited at this point, whether it's in baseball fiction or baseball film. You've got your baseball Annie, you've got your, drunk athlete, you've got, the Jerry Maguire kind of sports agent, taking sort of the expectations that, probably came from real life that had been sort of overblown and flattened a bit by the way they'd been represented in literature and film, and then sort of reinscribing nuance into those characters. So, chapter 2 and thinking about Tamara Rowland, like certainly drew from Bull Durham, right? And thinking about a baseball Annie, but trying to make her a more multidimensional person. And, I could point to people, real and not, pretty much in every chapter, and thinking about, how they had been maybe given a short shrift in beloved narratives, or it had been distilled in an unfair way, and adding some more nuance to their representations.
So, it's 7:49, so we have questions, but probably just time for maybe one more question. I see Maris, this is coming on. Okay, so I will just go for this one. What appealed to you about using the blurbs by the sports writer between chapters to further the narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really wanted to, while I was, several years into the book, but still trying to figure out the dimensions of it, I really wanted to do some research into place and situate. I understood the stadium was the stadium, but what was the stadium doing in that landscape, in that community, on the edge of Phoenix, and what was it pushing up against in terms of that mountain range, and just understanding the history of place, like in the biggest possible sense. And I had so I sort of wrote a geological history of the place, and it had this sort of strange voice that felt very different than the rest of the chapters and the rest of the stories and the rest of the characters. And it started picking up with revision more baseball language. And when I did establish the structure of the dominoes around Jason Goodyear, I realized they could slot in, and it went from being just a geological history of place and sort of situating along that timeline to it almost had this omniscient voice that felt like a Greek course. And it was definitely a risk, and I don't know that I pulled it off 100%, but I loved the idea of, if I am thinking about structure, if I am thinking about narrative, if there is someone who is operating as a Greek course, of course it would be the sportscaster, that or the sports writer who sees everything, who understands what's happened and can predict what might come along. He's got privileged information that he's not gloating about, but that he can share with the audience. And so I sort of retuned it towards that Greek course, and tried to hang on to some of the history of place.
Emily, I have to tell you that everything that you're saying about the chorus and the place and everything, this goes right along with all of my theorizing about the interdependent self. I'm going to send you a copy of that book.
Oh, well, I was going to buy it.
It's cast as East-West. It's cast as East-West, but it really is about an older and more dominant, I will say, self. And almost everything you said, I could have used you in all my lectures after. And when I was touring for Girl with the Baggage Claim and tiger writing, and I could say, see, Emily, here we have Emily Nemens saying, saying blah, 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 blah. I mean, truly, you could have been my case study.
Oh, well, I think, we're like,
it's very interesting.
We keep coming together.
Well, it was interesting to talk to you last year, and it's interesting to talk to you again.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Maris, I think we're done.
Yeah, what a great talk, though. And thanks to the audience. Please remember to buy those books in paperback if you haven't yet. And thank you both. This was wonderful.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
My pleasure too. Bye-bye.